If you're a millennial, you're supposed to have it all. Instead, you're working harder, earning less, and still falling further behind every year. So why is this generation stuck in crisis mode? Find out on today's episode of The Infographic Show. Millennials, born between 1980 and 1996, grew up with baby boomer parents, and that meant hearing about the good old days a lot. Boomers came of age in an era where the country was only going one direction, up. Hard work paid off, and the American dream was achievable. So as the 1990s wore on and the economy was booming, the future looked promising. All millennials had to do was work hard in school, get a good degree, and find a job that suits them. Then they'd be able to settle down and build a life and a family. Sure, the 1990s weren't smooth sailing, but there was nothing that truly threatened American dominance. The economy still felt unstoppable, and that sense of invincibility set millennials up for a brutal surprise. The 2000s seemed destined for endless opportunity, especially with the booming internet age. It looked like the millennials were walking into the perfect world, until they weren't. And then, on one Tuesday morning, everything changed. The 9/11 terror attack not only destroyed the Twin Towers, but they destroyed a sense of invulnerability that the United States enjoyed for a long time. This was the first major attack on U.S. soil since World War II, and it made people worry that more could be coming. Daily life tightened fast, crowds felt risky, travel felt hostile, and fear crept into everything. And incidents like the anthrax letter scare and the shoe bomber only made it worse. But it didn't matter, the damage was done. The stock market tanked, the economy froze, and panic hit hard. But while the country slowly recovered, millennials didn't. They entered adulthood right into the wreckage. But as bad as this crisis was, it could have been worse. President Bush advocated for economic activity to keep America strong, and the following wars were small-scale enough that a mass mobilization or draft wasn't needed. For most people, life would return to normal soon enough. But millennials wouldn't get normal back. This event largely defined the teen years and early 20s for many millennials, they being among the groups hit hardest because the attacks came right at a time where they were starting to get on their feet. The economic slowdown meant many companies, especially those based in New York, were no longer hiring in the aftermath. Travel became far trickier, and many airplanes cut back on flights. It's estimated that New York City alone lost $2.8 billion in wages and business revenue in the first 3 months after the attack. While the city received a hefty bailout from the federal government to aid in its recovery, many of the people on the ground saw opportunities vanish, never to return. And it wouldn't be the final blow this generation suffered. This was the biggest crisis millennials had ever seen, and it shook many of them to the core. This mix of patriotic fervor and disappearing job opportunities pushed many young people toward enlistment. But the dragged-out wars in Iraq and Afghanistan left numerous soldiers dead or injured. Frustration grew into a major backlash among young voters, especially after additional crises like the botched Hurricane Katrina response eroded trust in the Bush administration. But the worst was yet to come. As the Bush administration entered its last year, the oldest millennials were in their late 20s, and more were joining the job market every year. The economy had become increasingly digital, with startups raising billions of dollars and the Dow Jones shooting up as a result. Working in finance became a high-stakes game that could quickly make your fortune. And then, it all came crashing down. There were many causes to the 2008 economic meltdown, but one thing was sure, it was the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. The housing bubble burst, major banks collapsed, and the entire system unraveled. And as we all know, one collapse leads to another. The collapse caused a panic and a bank run akin to the disaster that struck the United States in the 1920s. The damage wasn't nearly as severe here, thanks to the government security measures that had been put in place after the Great Depression. Banks were insured, guaranteeing that if one failed, people's deposits wouldn't vanish with it. But when multiple banks collapsed and countless businesses followed, the system still buckled, sending shockwaves through the economy and putting millions of people out of work. And massive bailouts were required, devaluing U.S. currency, and no one knew where it would end. As for the millennials, well, it was a body blow. This is widely considered the crisis that did the most damage to the millennials. They graduated into a job market where no one was hiring, degrees didn't matter, experience didn't matter, even good jobs vanished overnight, and so did the future they thought they were building. And so the Great Recession led to the Great Homecoming. Many millennials either moved back home with their parents or just never left. The oldest millennials, approaching 30, had likely been renting and saving up for their first home. But now home prices were skyrocketing, and there were fewer companies willing to give out loans, and many of the top loan sources had gone out of business. Younger millennials found themselves settling for whatever job they could get, which often meant a recent graduate with a master's degree picking up hours at a retail job or fast food. And that won't pay the bills. In the years to come, millennials would become known as the failure-to-launch generation, as many of them would live with their parents well into their 30s. Those who didn't have that option or managed to move out often found themselves struggling to make ends meet and pay the rent. many with several roommates in a too small space, and that put many milestones out of reach. After all, no one wants to start a family without being settled in their career and having a nice nest egg. So many millennials waited and waited and waited. And as the 2000s gave way to the 2010s, most millennials entered their 30s, and the economy still hadn't recovered from the 2008 recession. And it soon became clear that certain things weren't coming back. Many of the companies that closed up shop weren't replaced, and those that survived never brought the size of their staff back to what it used to be. Housing prices didn't drop. Everyone was simply more cautious than they used to be, and that meant that the opportunities millennials needed just weren't there anymore. And it was almost time for the other shoe to drop. By 2019, the youngest millennials were settled into their adult lives. But while their parents may have had a steady job that lasted them decades, millennials were embracing another way: gig work. Many had several jobs that they cobbled together a living from. This had its disadvantages: no benefits and unpredictable earnings. But it also offered a level of freedom that was hard to find for older generations who typically had to maintain a strict schedule 5 days a week. Millennials were still on the struggle bus, but they were enjoying their social lives. And just when they thought nothing worse could happen, COVID shattered what little stability the millennials had left. Jobs disappeared, industries collapsed, and the world changed in an instant. Remote work helped some survive, but for many it was another derailed life milestone. Millennials did have one advantage during this period. They were the first generation to grow up with computers, and they were well equipped for the remote era. While they weren't digital natives, they had plenty of experience with them, and they were able to quickly adapt to working from home. Many of their gigs already used apps heavily, and millennials were the core of the workforce that kept many things working during the early days of the pandemic, delivering food and offering secure rides on rideshare platforms. But it was just another delay in their life plan. The COVID-19 pandemic didn't just cause devastating loss of life, killing millions of people worldwide and over 1 million in the United States alone. It also triggered a massive market crash and devastated commercial sectors. The year 2020 resulted in a 7% total drop in global commerce, and many businesses were reduced to bare-bones activity. Others went out of business entirely, either from not being able to make the rent or from their business no longer being viable in the new world. By April 2020, over 20 million Americans were unemployed, and many of those jobs never came back. COVID rewrote the entire world, with tens of millions of people being moved to either remote work or furloughed entirely. The pandemic itself was winding down by the end of the year as vaccines started rolling out. People hoped that it'd be back to normal soon, but it wasn't to be. While businesses received robust bailouts, it wasn't enough to save all of them. It was the knockout blow for some iconic chains, while other small businesses just faded off into the wind. At the same time, many companies came back from COVID with smaller workforces, outsourcing many of their jobs or just combining positions. And this was right around the time the new competition arrived. Millennials had spent plenty of time arguing with the older generations who they felt like didn't set them up for success. The boomers built a world that was supposed to work one way, and then it collapsed around the millennials as they were starting out in the world. And just as things were looking up, another massive crisis set them back again. And this was right around the time that Gen Z entered the fray. Fresh out of school and entering into a chaotic world that they didn't quite understand how to navigate either. The millennials were already behind, and now they were in danger of being lapped. For millennials, the kind of success their parents had seems more out of reach with each passing year. The oldest millennials are already approaching middle age, and that comes with a lot more than back pain. While the situation certainly wasn't ideal, many millennials have married and they have Gen Alpha kids going through school right now. That means that they're thinking about the future, about sending their kids to college, and even about retirement. And all of that seems further out of reach than ever. Gen Z grew up in a digital world. It's all they've ever known, but the millennials saw the tail end of one world and they grew up in another. This was evident everywhere you look, even in leisure. Millennials grew up with TVs that lasted decades. Now everything is subscription-based. Entertainment, security, even appliances. And each tiny bill eats away at what little financial progress they make. And the prices keep going up. There hasn't been another massive economic crisis since 2020, but that doesn't mean that things have calmed down. Quite the opposite, prices have been rising across the board. And what started out as a delayed adulthood has been turning into middle age without all the markers of adulthood. Inflation has been rising significantly over the last few years, hitting not just luxury goods but the necessities of everyday life. Forget owning a house or a car. Many millennials are wondering how they're gonna afford their next carton of eggs. And that was before the next crisis, a self-inflicted one. 2025 brought a wave of economic problems. Prices skyrocketed on imported goods, many of which had no domestic substitutes. Small businesses began to shut down as they couldn't get foreign supplies they depended on. And even worse, the morning cup of coffee was in danger. Since coffee can't be grown in the US, new tariffs hit the one little joy many millennials relied on to get their day started. That was until the levy was removed in the fall of 2025. And so it starts to feel like millennials aren't on a ladder, they're on a roller coaster. Millennials have an unpleasant distinction. They're the first generation to be worse off than the generation before them. They have struggled to reach the level of financial success the boomer and even the more low-key Gen X managed. And now they're staring at a nest egg that looks painfully empty, along with a future that feels more uncertain than ever. They benefit when the economy improves, but every new crisis that comes along seems to set them further back. They're not actually climbing the ladder. They are buying the illusion of it or renting it month by month at increasing rates. And it's getting harder and harder to make it to payday. Part of the reason millennials are struggling is because they advance, but they never quite make it out of the hole they're already in. Millennials carry far more debt on average than the previous generations, and many of it comes from the things that they were told would give them success. Millennials carry a heavy student debt, and many of them have been paying it off for decades, only to be still underwater because of the heavy interest rates. That means a large chunk of their monthly bills go to paying this off instead of building toward bigger purchases. And it becomes a cycle of lost money month after month. The housing market hasn't been friendly to first-time buyers since the 2008 recession, so it takes more than ever to put a down payment on a house and get approved for a mortgage. Millennials are still renting to a large extent, with only approximately 55% owning their homes, far below the average for boomers and Gen X at this point in their cycle. And the bigger challenge is that with each year that passes, the competition gets more intense as Gen Z enters their adult years and competes for the same opportunities. And if you ask millennials, it's not just bad luck, it's systemic. Millennials have had the worst streak of bad luck of any generation since the Lost Generation, which saw its numbers decimated by the combo of the First World War and then the Spanish flu. They graduated into the worst foreign policy crisis in decades, and then had the economic legs cut out from under them right as they were trying to find their footing in the job market. And every time they start to find their footing in a new paradigm, a new earthquake hits and upends their progress one more time. And so now there's a new threat millennials didn't see coming. It seems hard to believe, but 4 years ago, no one had ever heard of an AI chatbot. It went from experimental to unavoidable in just a few years. And suddenly, jobs millennials once considered safe started looking replaceable by a line of code. The dire predictions about AI taking everyone's jobs haven't come true yet. AI content has improved a lot since it started cropping up, and while it was initially embarrassingly obvious as fake, it's become harder and harder to tell. And that endangers countless jobs in the creative arts, which has led to many millennials seeking jobs in more secure areas. But those may be harder and harder to find. For a long time, the path to success was a steady, if boring office job that involved crunching numbers, but now those jobs are often heavily computer-assisted, and soon humans might not be needed anymore. And that has led to increased competition for the few jobs that are seen as technology-proof, blue-collar trades, as well as white-collar positions like teaching, medicine, and law. But the latter has a high bar to entry, bringing with it hefty college fees, and going back to school at this stage isn't on many millennials' agenda. For a while, millennials were seen as being too young to trust, but now they might be too old. The path to success for the boomers was to be stable and reliable at a steady job and get slowly promoted through the ranks. And in the past, that entry-level job was very easy to get. In the past, it often just took an interview and a handshake to send you up the corporate ladder. Today, when you're not underqualified, you are overqualified. The job market seems increasingly hostile, even more than after past financial crises, because it's not clear if anyone is hiring. Millennials apply to hundreds of jobs and hear nothing back. Entry-level roles demand years of experience, while advanced degrees get dismissed as overqualified. And that has left many millennials back where they started, picking up gig work and trying to make ends meet. And it feels like the clock is ticking down. Millennials aren't just struggling to make ends meet, they're watching as those ends get further and further apart. While we're not in a major economic crisis right now, you could fool anyone looking to buy a home or refinance a mortgage. Seems that just about everything is under corporate control now, and they're putting up a sign that says "No millennials allowed." There's always a high entry bar, be it a job, a house, or a loan. And for millennials, it feels like Groundhog Day all over again. Many millennials have been deferring marriage and family until they feel like they're more settled, but that kind of comfort and security might not be in reach anymore. Gen Z knows it, and it doesn't seem to care, with many of them eschewing the trappings of what used to be success and instead embracing a for-the-moment philosophy that many older generations say seems empty and nihilistic. They were promised a future that has never arrived, and every crisis pushed it further out of reach. For millennials, it's not just bad luck, it's a lifetime of climbing a ladder that was never really there. Now go watch Every Generation Explained in 10 minutes to find out the real differences, or click on this video instead.